Now, former Paralympian and convicted murderer Oscar Pistorius has been granted parole. The Department of Correctional Services confirmed yesterday that the parole board agreed to place Pistorius on parole from January of next year. The Paralympic athlete was sentenced to 13 years and 5 months for culpable homicide after he killed his girlfriend Reeva Steenkamp in 2013. Now, Reeva's mother, June, says she doesn't believe Oscar has yet been rehabilitated and fears for women after the precedent his parole sets. Let's focus now on the implications of a possible breach with legal analyst Melusi Xulu. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Perhaps let's start right at the beginning in trying to understand the parole process in South Africa, the purpose of parole, who qualifies for it, and the legislation that essentially governs it. What is it that needs to perhaps be well understood and clarified?
Okay. Good morning, Paul, and to the viewers at home. Thank you for having me. Parole is simply where a prisoner is released early before his sentence or her sentence expires. But it must be that you've at least had half of your sentence done before you are released, and then you can apply to the parole board to be released after half of your sentence has been done. Basically, the act that is relevant is Correctional Services Act 111 of 1998. That is the act that governs the parole. And what is important here, Mpo, is that obviously you're not guaranteed that you're going to be given a parole, because we need to consider whether you're rehabilitated. We need to consider your good record whilst you're in prison. So all of those things need to be considered. Especially, it's not just about the accused, it's also about the victim or the family of the victim. Like we've heard, reports and media conferences by I think it was the lawyer or the representative of the Steenkamp family, where also, I think as much as she doesn't believe he's rehabilitated, but Mrs. Steenkamp, John Steenkamp, believes that her considerations were also taken into account, because some of the conditions have been set. But here is what is important that I must not leave out. Once you are on parole until a certain period, there are still conditions that you have to adhere to. And if you don't, you then obviously be brought back to finish your sentence.
Yeah, so and what, Melusi, if you'd allow me just to interrupt you, what are the typical conditions that need to be taken into consideration before this process is fully underway?
Well, they need to consider whether, if you are granted a parole, will you be not a danger to the society. For instance, for Oscar Pistorius' case, I mean, we have issues of GBV in our country. It's just going to be 16 days of activism for violence against women and children. So it needs to be considered, if you are released, will you still be a danger to the society? So all of those things are important to see that you'll be on a good behavior when you're released.
You speak about June Steenkamp, Reeva Steenkamp's mother, saying that she doesn't believe that Oscar Pistorius has been fully rehabilitated. In fact, she says that she wonders whether his huge anger issues were truly dealt with in prison, and that she should be concerned for the safety of any woman, given what transpired. With that in mind, what forms part of the rehabilitation process before considerations are made on whether or not someone is eligible to be granted parole?
Well, for instance, you will be given a condition to do certain things whilst you're on parole, and if you commit to that, you possibly be granted for a parole. For instance, Paul, with Oscar's situation, he's been given a condition to attend a therapy for one GPV and ask for anger management. So I think what June Steenkamp also said was her concerns were also, considered, because she stated that at least he must. Well, she was worried about his anger management issue. So that is one of the ways which the parole is considering his parole board. Sorry. Yeah.
Is this process typical? The great amount of consideration that has been given to the Steenkamps as the victims, their interests and concerns being embodied, whether or not, in the process of trying to be part of the parole hearing. And, of course, Barry, who is Reeva Steenkamp's late father, as well as June Steenkamp, were also given an opportunity to speak and meet with Oscar Pistorius face-to-face, asking him a few questions, and still not convinced that he's telling the entire truth. Is this a typical process that would happen, or are we seeing this happening because of the high-profile nature of this case?
No, it's a typical way of doing it where everyone is involved, is the victim or the family of the victim if the victim is deceased, and everyone is involved, the fathers of the victim and the mother of the victim, as it was in this case. It's just that obviously, as you've said, the family of Reeva is not convinced entirely, but I also read where the attorney of, I think it's Nadia, the attorney of June Steenkamp, she said she prepared Mrs. Steenkamp far back in March when the parole was considered. She prepared her to be ready for him to be granted parole because he's already done half of his sentence. So, but to answer your question once again, yes, it's a typical way of doing it. It's not just because it's a high-profile case when these considerations are done where all parties are involved.
So we've been saying that Oscar Pistorius will be a free man, but that isn't typically the case come January 2024 because he still needs to serve out the rest of his sentence.
Yes, he still needs to serve out the rest of his sentence, but outside the correctional services facilities, and he needs to adhere to certain conditions. The two conditions that I just mentioned are ones that have been mentioned in the media, but I'm not aware what other conditions. But generally, one of the conditions might be that he reports to the correctional officer that will be assigned to him, and there are certain things that he must make sure that he reports to him. So I think as long as he adheres to those conditions after the 5th of January, if I'm not mistaken, 2024, he will still be on parole until he finishes his sentence outside the correctional services facilities. Then he'll be a free man, so to speak.
So what will happen in the instance, very lastly, Melusi, should he be found in breach of his parole conditions? How would that affect perhaps would it mean an extension of his sentence, or would he just be brought back behind bars to serve the remainder?
That's a great question. Let's say, I think he got a sentence of 13 years in 2016 because the murder happened in 2013. So he served half of his sentence since then, and then he applied for a parole. Now, let's say in a year's time, he doesn't behave himself or he doesn't adhere to the conditions, then he will have to continue the sentence that is left. So, say maybe 4 years is left out of his sentence, then he'll have to go back and be committed to that whilst he's in the correctional services facilities.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time, legal analyst Melusi Xulu, and of course giving us a sense of the process that needs to follow ahead of Oscar Pistorius' release. We know that he has been granted parole, and he will essentially be a free man come January 2024, and also giving us an understanding of what the parole process entails, the purpose of parole, and essentially who qualifies for it.